It's a beautiful day. It's not 100 degrees, so it's a really beautiful day. We have some visitors with us today. It's good to see you here as well. You're always welcome. A couple of quick reminders. I'm going back to camp on Saturday. There's a bunch of us who are going up for intermediate week. I'm just now getting over my post-camp cold from when I was there last week, so it's about time to crank it up again. I'm looking forward to getting sick again. But anyway, next Sunday, Danny and Isaac will be doing a joint preaching thing, not a translation thing, but two separate talks within the worship time. So I know you will be blessed if you're able to be here for that. I hope that you will be here for that. Because I am going to be gone next week, I just want to remind everybody, I know this is kind of personal, but it's kind of congregational. Hannah's graduation party is coming up on the 28th. Everybody's invited, which is the only reason I would be mentioning this from the pulpit. When I get back from camp next week, it's going to be inside of a week, and I'm going to be panicking. So the sooner you can RSVP, like RSVP ASAP, it would really help, because I'm going to try this week to figure out kind of approximately who's coming and how much food and all that. So please let me know. And if you could do it electronically, then I can keep track a little better. Facebook or, text or email, those things are all good. So thank you. Remember, everybody's invited. I just need to know if you're coming. Okay. Finally, next Sunday, I don't know if you guys recognize these two handsome dudes. These are our two elder candidates, Steve Sproles, John Toy. They've been elder candidates now for, I'm sure, what to them seems like 20 years. But in reality, it's been almost a year. And the elders have given the congregation almost a year to talk to them, get to know them, ask questions, find out where their head's at. And also a year to talk to the elders and to say, I'm not sure about this, or I've got some questions, some reservations. And so almost a year has passed, and this Sunday, the 15th, is the deadline. So if you have been thinking, I'm going to take the full year to really come up with some good questions and stuff, you're almost out of time. So next Sunday, and get your word in there, or get ready for the next thing. So I hope you'll take advantage of that opportunity if you haven't already. All right, we have been engaged in an ongoing conversation about Christianity and culture. We've been looking recently at what we're calling four different waves. These are shifts that have occurred in our culture fairly recently, and that have had a profound effect on our world, on our culture, an effect on a lot of different things. And so a couple of weeks ago, we started looking at these four waves. We talked about the first one being information overload, and the fact that in our culture today, we are bombarded more than we have ever been before with too much information, and not just information, but ideas. And so we struggle to make sense of those ideas and that information, and to choose the good stuff and to eliminate the bad stuff. And so this is affecting us. This is a struggle for us. 2 weeks ago, we talked about really one of the central core questions of our existence, which is, who am I? How do we determine what our identity is? The Bible speaks to that in certain terms, but our culture has other ideas. And so we need to be aware of the fact that many in our culture are seeking the answer to that question, who am I, in different ways and in different places than ever before. And so what do we do with that? Last week, we spent some time talking about some of the problems and consequences that can arise when we live life through our screens, which we all do, right? More and more we emphasize the electronic connections, and yet more and more our technology is producing in us isolation. Even as it connects us electronically, it is isolating us from one another in terms of human connections and human contact, and this is having profound ramifications in our culture. Just this past week, after preaching on this, I was doing some reading, and I stumbled on an article that was talking about a recent study that has been charting the growth of, I don't know how else to put it, self-mutilation in teenage girls. In our culture today, numbers from this year, studies are showing that 1 out of every 4 teenage young women in our culture, in our country, at some point in their life will cut themselves or burn themselves or in some way mutilate themselves. 1 out of 4, 25%. That's terrifying. And generally speaking, these are not women who are suicidal. They are not women that we would describe as having a severe mental illness. But one of the ways you can connect this to what we've been talking about is they say more and more this is coming from young women who are on social media to the point where their own image of their own body, what they should look like, has been driven by a culture's idea instead of what is real, and so they feel inadequate. And so this is one of the ways that they respond. And not only that, but the notion that we talked about last week, that more and more of these young women are living living through their screens. They are absent of adult relationships. They're absent of adult supervision. And so these things together produce this kind of consequence. This stuff is real, and it's affecting us. It's affecting our children. It's affecting us. It's affecting our culture. It's affecting the church. And so I point that out as yet another consequence of what can happen when we live lives through screens instead of through human relationship. Today we're going to talk about another major cultural shift that is, I think is also, we would say, having some wide-reaching effects in our culture, and it is connected with the rise of what has come to be known as youth culture, which is a fairly new term, something that didn't really exist probably 50 years ago. It's a situation that has been given a couple different nicknames that are kind of funny until you really dig in and realize what they're talking about. It has been called Peter Pan syndrome. It has been called failure to launch syndrome, although that one I think we have to be careful because I believe that's named after a Matthew McConaughey romantic comedy, so we should probably discount that as not good. An author, Diana West is her name. She has written a book called The Death of the Grown-Up, and she has termed it what we're going to use for our conversation. She's called it perpetual adolescence. It is no secret, I think, to any of us that we live in a cultural moment in which more than has ever happened in any other culture ever, we celebrate youth. It's not all good or all bad. It's just the reality of the situation. But what a lot of us maybe don't realize because of how we have grown up or because of our relative ages is that this is not how it's always been. This is, in our culture, a relatively new thing. And so we know some things about human development. We know that the human brain develops in stages. We know that young people and even teenagers, their brains are not wired the way that adults are. They're not fully formed the way that an adult brain is formed. And so we understand that there are some differences, but despite that, until fairly recently, what we have come to know as adolescence was really treated very differently in our culture. In adolescence, you had some expectations. When you were an adolescent 50 years ago, 100 years ago, you were expected to begin to take on some adult responsibilities. When you were an adolescent, you were expected to begin to make adult decisions. And sometimes, if you made bad decisions, you were expected to learn how to deal with the consequences of those decisions. And so adolescence, in a sense, even though at the time we probably didn't have the term or use the term, but we kind of knew what the ages were like, and we sort of treated it as a necessary rite of passage. It was something that you had to get through to get to something else that was more desirable, that was better for you in the long term. Now, I'm not saying all that is good, all right? You look back at some of the expectations that we put on our children and what we would call adolescence 100 years ago, some of that's crazy. I'm not saying that it's a good thing to get married as a teenager or to be forced without any options to join the full-time labor force or heaven forbid, as we've seen too often in our world, to be fighting in wars as a teenager. Those things are not all good. And so, even if you're older and maybe you've survived some of those experiences, I would guess you might not say, hey, it was great and I recommend it for everybody. But there was a shift that began in our country. You could probably start to trace it, like so many things, back to after World War II and how the world is profoundly different. And what began to happen was the transition from childhood to adulthood began to get delayed. It began to get pushed back. And so rather than a rite of passage that was designed to sort of prepare you for the next stage of life, adolescence became a place to linger. It became a place to hang out for a while. And maybe even to some extent, at some point, adolescence became almost a destination unto itself, a place that you want to go, a place that has a lot of benefits and not a lot of responsibilities. Now, you could probably argue for a dozen different factors and influences on this. I think a couple of things are interesting to note. In the post-war years, we saw the rise in America of the car culture. Some great things about that, some negative things about that. One of the negative things about that as far as adolescents go is that for the first time, really, ever, teenagers had other places to go and ways to get there. And so they could borrow the car because everybody had one now, and they could go travel around and do stuff. And very often they would go do stuff with other teens. And maybe you've got great memories of that. I've got great memories of that from my teenage years in the 80s. But also maybe you would realize sometimes because of that, the stuff you did when you got in your car and did stuff wasn't the best. And so this became more a norm. It had never happened before. And then there was the general increase in affluence in our country. Affluence gives us options, right? It gives us choices. And really not just for adults, but this is when marketers began to discover that, you know what, kids have money too. Kids have buying power too, and so they can do those things. They can do things with that. And this is along with the rise, we would say, the exploding entertainment culture in which there became more and more things to do, more and more places you could go to spend your money and to do things that were fun, things that were amusing. And so this kind of goes along with the rise in affluence. And I think even in a more modern setting, the rise of what we would call gamer culture, where people spend hours and hours and hours with technology enabling them to have an immersive experience that seems real even though it's not. And so things that feel real but that aren't, that's kind of appealing. No, when you're in a first-person shooter and you're playing with your buddies online and you keep getting killed, well, that's okay because it's just a video game, right? It's not real. But it's not real when you live in that world for too long. It begins to have an impact. So a lot of factors. Those are just a couple worth mentioning, I think. Whatever the combination, two big things, really big things, have changed as we have moved in this direction in our culture. One is that young people are now being pushed into adolescence earlier and earlier. And we probably know and understand this from our own kids. We have subcategories of adolescence now, right? We have preteens, or sometimes we call them tweens, which is the kids who are not quite little kids anymore, but they're not quite officially teenagers yet, but they're their own thing, and they have money too. Billions of dollars of money. And so because of that, they have their own TV networks. They have their own music. They have their own fashions. People are marketing toward them, making things and doing things aimed just at them. And that has a profound impact on our culture. On average now, I was surprised, but not really surprised, to hear that the average young person in America gets their first cell phone at age 10. Age 10. That's really young. Your brain is a mess at age 10. Sorry, all you 10-year-olds in the audience. But so I don't know what we're doing, but I do know that the pool of adolescence is expanding from the bottom, right? It's getting bigger because we're adding on the bottom of the pool. So that's one thing that's happening. At the same time, many of the typical, what we would call markers of adulthood, they are beginning to happen later and later in life. And so we see things like, moving out of the family home, getting established in what will be sort of a career track, not just a job, but what you would like to do with your life, marrying, having children. And so this means that as the preteens are expanding the pool of adolescents at the bottom, the pool is also expanding at the top, because the top range of what used to be considered an adolescent is getting higher. The roof is getting higher. And so this group continues to grow. Now, I want to say this, and I want you to hear me very clearly. That second change, the fact that certain things in our culture are happening later, like getting married and having children, that is not all bad. This is not like many issues, like most issues in culture. These are not simple. These are not one-size-fits-all, black and white kinds of stuff. And so I think that needs to be said. And so not everyone who moves out of the family home later or marries later or has children later does so for reasons that should concern us. Now, that's not always the case, but it is alarming that at some point in our culture, a shift has occurred. And so now for many people in our culture, even people who are way past what any reasonable person would consider to be adolescent, it now seems desirable to prolong our adolescence as long as possible. It's become almost a goal in our culture. And so if you're still living at home with your parents, or you haven't married because you're not willing or not able to accept adult responsibilities or to make adult decisions, that is a problem. It's a big problem. And it's a problem in our culture. And it's a problem, again, as with all of these things, it's a problem with repercussions. It's a wave that creates other waves, that causes other things to happen. And so these shifts, they end up influencing and helping to create some other issues that are very significant that we're going to end up talking about starting in 2 weeks. I'll give you some more information on that as we close this morning. But I want us to talk just for a second about some of the realities of perpetual adolescence, some of the things that we need to understand and be aware of as we try to figure out all this stuff and how it all fits And eventually, as we get to the point of saying, well, what can we do about it? I mentioned before the reality that young people are marrying now at a greater age, a higher age. I don't know what the term. They're marrying older. The average marrying age in 1960 in America, if you were a man, you got married on average about 23, and if you were a woman, you typically were married by the time you were 20. No comments, I know. We got a lot of differences in the congregation, but track with me. 1990, those numbers had increased to where the average man was waiting till 26 and the average woman to 24. And as of the most recent numbers that I could find, being from 2015, the average man now in our culture gets married at 29, the average woman at 27. And again, let me say, that's not all bad. And speaking as somebody who was engaged and married at a very young age, it's not all bad to wait. All right? Don't hear me. I'm not saying this thing is 100% one way or the other. But one of the downsides to that struggle is something that the Bible addresses, Paul talks about. It is the pursuit of sexual purity. You know, as Christians, that's a big thing to God, right? God talks about sexual sin comprehensively in the Bible, and in particular in the New Testament. And I think that probably all of us who have lived for any length of time would probably say, with one voice, sometimes it is hard to live according to God's sexual ethic. God's sexual ethic is demanding. It seems at times unnatural. It's hard. It's a struggle. And so, that ethic is, I think, very clearly laid out for us in the Word of God. The Bible describes sex and human sexuality as a beautiful thing, a created thing, a gift from God, but that it belongs in context. It belongs in the context of a man and a woman who are married to each other. And each one of those things matters. Each one of those things is important. Again, more on that in a couple of weeks. The thing is, God's sexual ethic has not changed. And you go back to the garden, and you track it all the way through the Bible, and you extrapolate forward to today, and you realize God's ideas about this. God has said, look, this is what it is. This is how it should work. This is what I want from you. It hasn't changed. Culture's sexual ethic changes constantly, seemingly daily. There's something always being added or twisted. And so here's the thing. Now, by postponing marriage, what we're asking of our young people, excuse me, look at these numbers again. What we're asking of our young people today, as opposed to those of us maybe who were teenagers in the 60s, is you need to follow the Bible's sexual ethic and maintain sexual purity longer than ever before. Maybe 5, 6, 7 years longer than some of us had to try to be pure because we weren't married. Man, that's a big ask, isn't it? That's a hard thing. And not only are we being asked to do that, but we're asking our kids to do that because it's the right thing to do. It's the godly thing to do. But we're asking them to do that, to be sexually pure 5, 6, 7 years longer, while, oh, by the way, existing in a culture that is saturated with sex, and a culture in which pornography is right there at your fingertips anytime, free and easy, and available with no cultural stigma attached. So go out there and be sexually pure according to God's plan. And you know what? A lot of our teens, a lot of our adolescents, at some point, they kind of stop trying because it's really hard. There's another thing that has emerged as the pool of functional adolescence has grown, and it's also troubling, and it is that we're beginning to see more and more an increase in what you might call an adolescent's moral flexibility. Stuff that's happening in culture is having an effect on how they think. And so our culture tells adolescents, you need to trust and follow your feelings. Logic and reason and all these other things. What does your heart tell you to do? And you should do that. And so that's a core message. And so no matter where those things lead, follow your heart. Our culture says to them, you need to pursue happiness at any cost. You being happy is the most important thing. And so do that with all your heart. They're told that they should be protected from any ideas that people might have that they might find objectionable or confrontational, and that they alone are the arbiters of truth for themselves, and that of all the cultural values that we esteem, that of the highest value in culture is tolerance. This is the message that they are receiving, and all of which makes it really hard to convince them about the realities, and I use that word purposely because it comes from God, the realities of things like sin, which is a thing. How do you convince a kid about that? when they've been told, there's no such thing? How do you convince a kid that there's such a thing as morality, that there's such a thing as objective truth, things that are true for all people in all places at all times, it doesn't matter what? And so perpetual adolescence has consequences, doesn't it? It has consequences. Well, again, I want to remind you, maybe you've been frustrated at this point with these 4 waves in particular, because I said from the beginning, and I want to repeat again, we're not coming in saying, here's the solution to this. I think this really is all about not the solution to these problems, but about trying to get the lay of the land, trying to understand the water in which we swim, the air in which we breathe. We're trying to understand what's going on around us and why it's going on around us, because it has impacted so many things. And so really so that as Christians we can grow in our culture to become shapers instead of shapees, right? It comes back to the cookie, so that we can go out into the culture and be the chocolate chips that hold their shape in the batter, the dough of the culture in which we live. And so that's why we've been doing this. But it is worth mentioning at this point the need for all of us to start to think about how we might deal with adolescence differently. And I think that's whether we are at a place in life where we're approaching adolescence, or whether perhaps we've been in it longer than we should and we're somehow trapped in it, or maybe we're hoping to help somebody to navigate their way through it. There are a lot of things that we've tried to do over the years to try to deal with this kind of thing. One of the things we like to do with adolescents is we like to make rules. And so rules are necessary. Rules are good in certain ways within certain contexts, but eventually an adolescent moving into adulthood has to be taught how to discern what is right from what is wrong when there isn't a rule. How do they apply principles? How do they apply the things that God has given them, in which maybe it's not laid out in black and white? And they need to also learn and understand how to discern what to do when they discern poorly, because they will. It's part of that process. And you notice one of the other techniques we sometimes use, if we're not making rules, sometimes we like to motivate adolescents by incentive. Well, I'm going to try to get you to do the right thing because I'm going to give you some reward. There's money at stake, or a new car, or something like that. And so the problem with that is, eventually, if our kids are trained that you do good only with the prospect of reward, they become people who learn, well, what's in it for me? I'll do it if there's some benefit to me. And let's be honest, culture is probably going to offer them some more attractive incentives for bad behavior than we can ever offer them for good behavior. And so we've got to be careful about that as well. And so I think what adolescents need more from Christians, from families, from the church, is they need character development, right? They need what we all need. They need spiritual maturity. They need what we've been talking about time after time after time, which is they need to become disciples, which means we need to be making disciples of our kids. We need to be doing that in our homes. We need to be doing that in our small groups. We need to be doing that in our churches so that they can go out into culture, because we love them and that's what's best for them. And so if that's what we truly want out of our kids, like we want for ourselves, if we want them to become cultural shapers instead of cultural shapees, we have to acknowledge that the task is a lot bigger than simply getting our kids baptized, right? Would we all agree with that? We have a job to do and an approach to change. All right. One more thing, since we got a couple extra minutes. I did a slide. I wasn't sure we'd have time. In 2 weeks, when I'm back from camp, we're going to start to talk about some of these specific issues that have arisen in our cultural climate. And these are things in which there's a clear difference between what culture is saying and what the Bible is saying. And so we're going to attempt to look at some of these issues and really approach it from that perspective. Here's the message of culture. Here's what the Bible says. Maybe here's an approach that we can use to try to navigate our way through and to try to have some impact. That's going to be the attempt. And so I'm going to give you a list. I'm going to tell you right now it is subject to change. I don't know if it's the final list. I don't know if the schedule certainly is going to be the same, but I thought you might want to know what's coming. And so we're going to talk about the erosion of our culture in these areas. I put the first one together to tell you that's more than a one-week conversation. One of the authors I've been reading describes those issues collectively as the pelvic issues. I found that worthy of chuckling. But really, these are big things. These are huge issues in our culture. powerful, and the church is struggling to know what to do and really struggling with knowing how to respond and how to be proactive. And so we're going to talk about sexuality, gender, pornography. We may even broaden that a little bit. We're going to talk about marriage and entertainment. We're going to talk about race, ethnicity, materialism, consumerism. We're going to talk probably about addiction. And then I think we would be remiss if we didn't spend a little time talking about politics alongside patriotism, which is another area in which culture says one thing, and I am more and more convinced that the Bible says something else. So that's what's coming, and I hope that you will be around. And I think we should stand and sing. Come on, Dan.
Lord, it's not my home.